Hello everybody, it is Chimso here. Today we're doing something a little different. We're taking a look at the new Ryze. The recent gameplay update that he got in patch 5.8 has changed quite a bit about his kit, but it's also left quite a bit similar as well. Now, for those of you who don't know already, maybe you're just joining the channel, I'm a Season 4 Ryze main. I mained Ryze in Season 4 from Silver 2 to Platinum 4. I played a lot of Ryze, and he basically got me to where I am now. And that was on the old Ryze, and back then, you know, he had a whole bunch of buffs, and since then he's had a whole bunch of nerfs and buffs. He got his Q damage taken down by 20 at all ranks sometime earlier in the season. Then he got it raised again, and now they've actually just straight up reworked quite a few of his abilities. So I had a game with him, and these are just going to be my first impressions, but I'll give you some general information first. So let's start off with his passive. So Arcane Mastery has changed, well, pretty much completely. He now basically has two passives. The first is the old one. Well, he's always had two passives really, but the old passive of his abilities scaling with his mana remains the same. So he still has mana scaling on his Q, his W, and his E, but a new component is that Ryze's spellcaster now give him stacks. And at 5 stacks, Ryze will basically enter like a beast mode, where he gains a shield that scales off of 20 plus 5 times his level, plus 8% of his maximum mana. And for the same duration as the shield, his spellcast will reduce all of his other spells cooldowns by the cooldown of his Q, Overload, and they're able to be brought to a minimum of 0.25 seconds that way. Now this stack buff will last for 3 seconds, plus 1 second for every rank you have in his ultimate, Desperate Power. So what this basically does is, it allows you to, you know, you no longer have his old passive wherein every spell you cast, it reduces the cooldown of all your spells by 1 second. Now your spellcast actually give you stacks, which will decay over 12 seconds. And once you hit 5, you enter a sort of supercharge mode where you then get a massively reduced cooldown for all your spellcasts while you're in it, and also a shield for that close range combat, because despite the fact that he is a bit more versatile now, Ryze is still a short range mage for sure. Now this is actually really interesting because, well, I'm not going to lie, I found it pretty fun actually. The shield is really helpful, especially if you combine it with the shield from Seraph's Embrace, and I'll talk about the modification I made to my build later on. Jeez. But yeah, it's really fun. It gives you now your passive scales with mana as well. So there's even more incentive to build a lot of mana. And it basically makes up for the sort of loss of tankiness he gets because of a little buff, actually, that actually makes you sacrifice several important items, in my opinion. But we'll get to that. So anyways, his Q, this is the other ability that was changed quite a bit. Now, instead of being a simple point and click like it was before, he now throws a ball of energy in a line. I'm disappointed the ball of energy is not red, because Overload used to be red, and as a Ryze main, that offends me. Not really, I don't give a shit, but I think they should change it to red again since, you know, thematics. Come on, guys. But anyways, he now throws it as a skill shot instead. And this has a range of 900, which compared to the old range of his Overload, 600, it's actually more significant. But this is obviously at the cost of it being a skill shot, so you actually have to hit it. And not a very fast skill shot at that. It's not slow, but it's not ridiculously fast either. So you have to make sure you hit it. And also you can't harass through minions with it, which is a bit disappointing. Certainly hurts Ryze top a bit, though maybe it actually helps Ryze mid because of that range. But anyways, another important aspect is that the mana cost has actually gone down. Previously, the cost of all of Ryze's abilities, his Q, his W, and his E, were all 60 at all ranks, which made him have a very tough early game managing his mana. However, Overload at rank 1 is now 30 mana, and this goes up by 5 every rank you put into it, up to 50 mana. So his Overload actually costs less mana now, which really helps in the early game when you're trying to farm, especially in top lane, which is why I think top lane Ryze can still work pretty well, because he can still, he can farm a lot easier now with that overload, and he can also still use it when he gets jumped on, because if an enemy's jumped right on top of you, they're going to be right in your face, so you can just chuck the skill shot at him. So it still works pretty well, but it's a bit more difficult for him to actually gain pressure in the lane, because he can't harass with his overload, and the mana cost of his other spells remain the same and go up with level as well. But anyways, this scales off of 55% of your AP. At rank 1, it is 65 damage, and this goes up to 90 at level 2, 115 at level 3, 140 at level 4, and 165 at level 5. That's not really too important, but it's now more powerful than it was before if you hit it. And it also scales with 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4% of your maximum mana, which I actually believe is a decrease. I think it used to be high before. But nevertheless, it makes farming easier early on. The cooldown is the same. It no longer grants passive cooldown reduction, but we'll get to that in his ultimate. But it also costs less mana, so it definitely helps him out early on in top lane and gives you more of an ability to farm, essentially. You can not get pushed back as hard as you would in the past. Anyways, onto his W. Now, this is pretty much exactly the same. His Rune Prison. He's still... I think the root duration is exactly the same, so 0.75 at rank 1, then 1, 1.25, 1.5, and 1.75 seconds. However, if I recall correctly, the damage has gone down. Pretty sure it used to actually gain scaling damage per level on mana, but now it's just a flat 2.5% mana at all times, and the same with his E, actually. But yeah, same as before, his Rune Prison, with two changes. 1, less damage. 2, increased mana cost. At rank 1, it's still the same, 60, but it goes up by 10 per level, up to 100 mana at level 5. So it can actually be a bit costly later on. Onto his E, Spell Flux, once again, remains pretty much the same. It still bounces around enemies. It still reduces their magic resistance by a percentage. And, let's see here. Each enemy affected takes magic damage. Yeah, so it's basically the same. I'm pretty sure they reduced the damage on it as well. And each secondary target it hits gains only takes half the damage, of course. But yeah, they've definitely reduced the damage on that as well, I can see. And that has a cooldown of 7 seconds. And they've also increased the mana. Same with Rune Prison for 60 level 1 to 100 at level 5. Now onto Desperate Power, his ultimate, which it, along with his passive, are probably the two main changes in his kit. So, first of all, the passive of his ultimate. Ryze now gains cooldown reduction, and the passive increases the duration of his normal passive. So, he actually gains 10% cooldown reduction at level 1, 20% at level 2, and 30% at level 3. So Ryze naturally gains 30% cooldown reduction as opposed to the 10% that he naturally gained before from his Q. This really changes up his builds. If he hadn't had that, if they didn't include this passive and they just kept the 10% on his Q, his build wouldn't be that different. But now, because of this, there's actually a lot more thought you have to put into the builds than before. But when activated, it's basically the same as his old ultimate. He gains movement speed in Spell Vamp and, you know, AoE damage around the target, very target that you hit. So, what this has basically done, and I still think the most significant part is the passive cooldown reduction on his ultimate, is it's sort of taken Ryze away from a more defensively orientated mage, like a bruiser mage, and instead taken him to more of a pure mage, which is why I think Ryze in the mid lane, it will be very good in my opinion, probably even better than Ryze in the top lane. And they've done this because you don't need to buy Frozen Heart anymore for that 20% cooldown reduction. Basically, before, Ryze used to only have 10% natural cooldown reduction from 5 points in his Q. So what you would do is you would go 9, 0, 21, taking the cooldown reduction in 5% cooldown reduction in the offensive tree and the 5% in the utility tree. And then you get the 10% from your Q and then 20% from Frozen Heart. That gives you a bit of tank, it gives you 40% CDR, you're balling. Now on the other hand, you don't really need that 20% cooldown reduction from Frozen Heart, because if you're going 9-0-21, you have the 10% cooldown reduction, and then you have 3 points in your ultimate, which will also give you 30% cooldown reduction, giving you 40%, the max. So you actually don't need to build any cooldown reduction on Ryze at all. He just innately gets it from both runes, from masteries and his ultimate. This is good and it's bad. First of all, it's good because you don't need to build Frozen Heart anymore, which means you can go for more damage early on. However, it's also bad because it decreases your defensive capabilities, obviously. Getting a Frozen Heart, that 100 armor, really makes you much more survivable in fights. But to compensate for that, they've obviously given you the shield on his passive, which will now give you, for every 5 spells you cast, it will give you a shield that lasts for a certain amount of time. One thing I forgot to mention about his passive, by the way, is while it's active, while you have the shield, you will not gain stack. So you can't just keep refreshing the shield over and over or stacking it. You have to wait until the shield fizzles out first, and then you can start stacking it again. So, yeah, New Ryze basically is more of a mage than he is a bruiser now. He is safer, he can farm a bit easier in the top and the mid lane because of the fact that his Q is now a skill shot and it's longer range. And, well, I think he's not too different. I mean, yes, he has obviously got quite a few changes here, and he is definitely harder to play now. He's not as easy to play as before, not just for the fact that his Q is a skill shot, but his combos are going to be a bit more complicated now because of the fact that his passive now has to be stacked in order to give him the decreased cooldown on his spells. But the fact that you can do that, and you can also another thing, the Desperate Power now has a ridiculously short cooldown. At rank 5, it's 40 seconds, and if you have 40% cooldown reduction, it's 24 seconds. So you can literally get 5 stacks of your Arcane Mastery, hit your Desperate Power, chuck spells out, and then once you're done, once your Arcane Mastery runs out, you have Desperate Power up again. It's pretty powerful. But yeah, the main thing to take note of is now that he does not get just one second of cooldown reduction for every spell he casts. He now has to have 5 stacks in Arcane Mastery, and then that will reduce the cooldown of all of his spells by the cooldown of Overload. So if Overload is at a 2.4 second cooldown, like it would be if you had 40% cooldown reduction, then it would reduce the cooldown of all your spells by that much, except for Overload itself, I believe. No, I think it does decrease Overload by the same amount. I don't know. I'll have to look back at that, but he's definitely more powerful, but he's more difficult to play, which I think is the complaint a lot of people had. People are saying, you know, he's too easy to play for how powerful he is, and you know, his early game is not as weak as it could be. So we'll see where this goes. In my opinion, his early game's actually stronger now, but you have to play more carefully in the late game because your defenses are contingent upon the stacks of your passive, instead of just simply the armor you would get from Frozen Heart and any of the other defensive items you might have that you probably just won't build anymore because you don't need them. You waste a lot of their stats because of the fact that you now get cooldown reduction from your ultimate. So build-wise, I still think that Tear and Roa are essential on Ryze. Obviously, they're the 2 mana items, and Ryze is built around mana, basically. So you definitely want to get Tear as soon as possible, and then go into Roa. However, then I hit a bit of a brick wall, because I was like, okay, after this, I would normally build Frozen Heart, but you don't need Frozen Heart anymore. So what I decided to do was instead immediately upgrade my Tear into a Archangel Staff to help stack it faster, because Ryze does not stack, he does not stack up as fast, in my opinion, especially in the top lane. You don't get as many stacks of, for your Tear as you would if you were the old Ryze, where you just spam every spell, because every spell had the same mana cost, so it wasn't a problem. Now, if you want to conserve mana, you have to use your Overload, which has significantly less mana cost than the rest of his abilities. So I found out going to Steros was actually a good idea. Then I went for a Blasting Wand. No, sorry, not a Blasting Wand. Well, I went for a Blasting Wand, but then I went for a how can I fucking forget the name? Void Staff. That's right, I went for a Void Staff for Magic Pen, and I also bought Ninja Tabi in this game. which I later sold for Merc Treads, but I got them because I thought I might have some trouble against Fiora early on, but I didn't really. But yeah, and then after that, you know, you could probably go like Deathcap, GA. You probably want to still try and get at least one defensive item on Ryze. GA is definitely a good choice. Zhonya's is actually a good choice now, in my opinion. Before, you wouldn't get it because Frozen Heart was simply better with the rest of his kit. But now, if you want an armor item, Zhonya's is definitely a good choice. I'll have to experiment around with it, but I think the new Ryze is pretty fun. Bad thing about the old Ryze is that you get bored of him really quick because it's much of the same. But this Ryze can actually make for some exciting plays. But, yeah, that's about it, I guess. Thank you all for watching. I hope you learned a bit here. I'm looking forward to playing the new Ryze. He seems fun. And I think Riot has done a pretty interesting job. I mean, as always, this is nothing what I would have thought, like, they'll change it. But, yeah, we'll just have to see how it goes. I think it can be pretty strong if you learn how to play it correctly. It's definitely harder to play. But, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's similar, but it's also different, which I like. But yeah, thank you all for watching. I'll catch you all next time. If you want more Ryze content, I'm definitely happy to make it. I can play around with him a bit more. But apart from that, I'll see you all next time. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.